So, good evening, and welcome to the seminar entitled The Future of Russia-West Relations. My name is Martin Kragh. I'm the head of the Russia and Eurasia program here with the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And it is my great pleasure to present and introduce our two speakers today. Next to me, I'm very glad to present Lilia Shevtsova, a Russian political analyst associated with the Chatham House in London, the Liberal Mission Foundation, and the New Eurasia Foundation in Moscow, among other institutes. Many of you are probably aware of Shevtsova's publications, which regularly appear in not only the academic press, but also Foreign Policy, Financial Times, Washington Post, and other news outlets. To your right is Gudrun Persson, director of the Russia Studies program with FOI, the Swedish Defense Research Agency. As you are all aware, Gudrun Persson is a well-known expert on Russian politics and security. Lilia Shevtsova, you will begin the seminar giving us an introductory presentation, maybe 25 minutes or so. After which we continue into the discussion with Gudrun Persson and Lilia. And towards the end of the seminar, we will open up for Q&As with the auditorium. So, Lilia, пожалуйста.
Thank you, Martin. It's a privilege to be here. It's a great pleasure and it's honor to speak before the Swedish audience, and I'm so glad to see in the audience the best of the best, the cream of the cream, former Swedish ambassadors in Russia. Sven Hirdman, Orion Berner, Thomas Bertelman. Yes, my favorite Swedish ambassador to China, too. And representative? Where is the representative of Johan Molander? Where is she? Okay. And I really am a little bit nervous speaking before you because you can check my words and my conclusions with the reality, and you know reality. So anyway, let me get the ball rolling. It's reckless and apparently it's impossible to give due to the subject, Russia's foreign policy and Russia's relations with the West in mere 25 minutes. That's why, if I may, I will try to discuss only the most important from my point of view, the trends, the skeleton of the Russian foreign policy activity, its nature, its characteristics, its premises, its goals, and the major conundrums that Russian foreign policy and the Russian system is encountering today. And I will start with a couple of general assessments. You know, when I'm watching the Russian developments from inside, or when I'm traveling and try to watch it from outside, I'm mesmerized. I'm confounded and shocked very often by the whole construct and the whole drama of the Russian state civilization that definitely has lost its steam, that apparently is in the process of decline, that is losing its potential, that has failed so far to modernize itself after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and apparently will have problems with securing the current status quo, and nobody knows in Moscow whether this current status quo exists. But at the same time, the state civilization is limping ahead, having ability and recklessness to kick over the global chessboard, spreading fear and suspense on the international scene. And there is something ironic and paradoxical too, in the very fact that we see the system, we see civilization, yes, unique because of one fact. Because it succeeds to survive using not only domestic resources, but exploiting the resources of the rival, of opponent of the collective West pretty successfully. And engaging with the West, succeeding by personally integrating with its elite, with its business into the fabrics of the Western society to undermine the West. Pretty unusual phenomena. And I don't know a single one, another one in the current modern history. As for the foreign policy has been very successful means and instrument to serve domestic agenda in Russia. It has been multifunctional. It plays different roles, and it can simultaneously to distract people's attention in Russia from domestic woes, to mobilize population around the authorities. It can give legitimacy to the very important element of the Russian system, its great power status, the spine of the Russian personalized system, pretty effectively and in a very astute way. But I would like also to mention one very interesting thing about the role of the foreign policy, at least until recently, and I wonder whether my friends ambassadors would agree with me. Until recently, the Russian foreign policy was compensating shrinking domestic resources and creating benevolent external environment for the Russian economy, for Russian economic growth, and for Russia's modernization. And recently something has changed. Recently, very often, the Russian foreign policy is pursuing the goal to preserve, to guarantee, to secure great power gains and status at the expense of the Russian economic growth. So this is the problem that is felt already in Moscow. Now let me just give you a list of some points in a brush way, approach. Firstly, I here have some, at least of them, listed, penciled here. What the Kremlin is trying to do now with the foreign policy, with its international activity. The Kremlin is trying to accommodate, to adapt its foreign policy means and paradigm and formula to the new environment and to the new reality. If, for instance, during the Soviet times, the formula of Russian foreign policy could be defined in the following way: to be with the West and to be against the West, so to cooperate with the West, exploiting the Western resources, and contain the West, insulate the Russian society from the Western impact. After the 1991, Martin, is it I'm cracking?
You're a little bit too close.
Too close? Okay, sorry. After 1991, we have another formula that we can call a triad: to be with the West, which means to cooperate with the West in many areas of interest, to be inside of the West, to use globalization for personal integration of the Russian political and business elite into the Western society. And in this sense, Russia, together with China, became the, in fact, beneficiaries of globalization. And to be against the West, so to contain the Western influence. So this is the formula. But now the Kremlin is being forced to adapt this formula to the new historical and geopolitical context. That includes dwindling home domestic resources, the collapse, the failure of the previous consensus, Kremlin consensus, that guaranteed support on the part of the Russian society for the Kremlin. Failure of the previous stage of the Russian foreign policy that I call shock and all that the Kremlin pursued in 2014, 2015, and the attempt to get to the more, I would say, more consensual policy with the West. And finally, the Kremlin has somehow to sort out the new geopolitical situation that has emerged with the Trumpiana leadership, with the black hole in Washington, with a situation where now we don't understand in what direction the flip-flopping America and Washington will move. So it's a pretty formidable task for the Kremlin to update, to renovate, and to accommodate foreign policy to the new reality. So what is being done in this direction? A couple of strokes on the evolution of the Russian foreign policy. Well, I already mentioned that we have the cycle that is over, the cycle of 2014, 2015, when the Russian political elite tried to force the West, collective West, but firstly and mostly the United States of America, to accept Russia's rules of the game and on Russia's terms. And of course, this confrontational cycle with Crimea annexation, with the pattern of Russia as a besieged fortress, was first of all inspired and provoked by domestic needs. In 2013, Putin's approval rating collapsed to 30%, and 45% of the Russian respondents didn't find any political leaders that they could trust. So in 2014, 2015, aggressive foreign policy created a new consensus. We call it Crimea post-Crimea consensus, with amazing, mesmerizing approval rating for Putin, 85%. But by the end of 2015, early 2016, this new consensus and new approval were over. People started to demonstrate tiredness of military rhetoric, tiredness of besieged fortress paradigm, and it became evident for the Kremlin and for the Russian political elite. We have to get out of that. We have to get out of the confrontational moods. 66% of the Russian respondents already early 2016 wanted Russia to be on friendly terms with the West. 60% in the mid of 2016 wanted Russia and Ukraine to be friendly countries. It was evident that the military rhetoric, military epoch is over. We have to search. We have to start searching for a new, much more friendly and accommodating pattern regarding the West. And what are the premises? What are the premises of the Russian foreign policy now? And here I have to mention that there's a lot of imitation going on. And sometimes we experts, myself included, watching, these movements, actions on foreign policy and domestic fields every day from early morning till night are too late to decipher where the Kremlin is really going. And very often we are reacting to these moves. And so let's take some of the rather popular beliefs among the Western punditry about the motivations of Russian foreign policy. Well, here I have the quote from the recent report prepared by several of Washington American think tanks. And according to this report, the key motivation of the Russian foreign policy is vulnerability, insecurity. Gudrun apparently understands who the writers are. Vulnerability and insecurity are the key drivers of the Soviet and post-Soviet foreign policy, write the authors of the report. The Russian elites are guided by a deep-seated sense of vulnerability vis-à-vis the West and fear of the West. So this is rather popular belief in other Western circles, I hope not in Sweden. And apparently this belief is the result or is provoked by the Russian constant litany about Russia's humiliation. When in reality what we have in the Russian political and foreign policy mentality is something a bit different. We could see this so-called cognitive dissonance Cognitive dissonance that includes, yes, on the one hand, understanding of the Russia's weakness, and it's totally understandable with Russia's GDP amounting to 1.5% of the global GDP and Russian economy that amounts to 1/15 of the American economy. Yes, we are vulnerable when we are talking about economic and social situation. But at the same time, this cognitive dissonance includes something else, includes, inherent cockiness, and I would say assertiveness and self-assuredness, which apparently is the result of the Russia's political leader and the Kremlin experience in dealing with other Western political leader and Western political elite. Another popular belief is that the motivation of the Russian foreign policy is the concept of Eurasia, traditional Russian concept. Yes, one could smell at least fragrance and some leftovers of Eurasianist sentiments in the Russian foreign policy doctrine, but mostly in rhetoric of the mainstream and experts. But in reality, Eurasian Union and any dream about Eurasian alliance has been dustbin after Ukraine started its move, towards Europe. And without Ukraine, hardly one could dream about any Eurasian Union with Asiatic face. So there are other moves and attempts to find a new motivation, a new basis, as a premise of the Russian foreign policy. There are attempts, for instance, to combine the former Eurasian myth with an attempt to justify, we've been talking about Kragh just 5 minutes ago, to combine it with the dream about Russia-Chinese axis and combination of Eurasianism plus Silk Path of China. There are also some elements or some arguments in favor of turning, Russia into Eurasian Pacific country, but again, in this case, Russia will meet China that has started to demonstrate its own global ambitions. Finally, there is some kind of a game, and the game that has been provoked by Zbigniew Brzezinski a year ago. Remember when he, in fact, published the idea about the triangle between America, Russia, and China. But again, it looks like a very naive concept of, of actors that hardly could become, bedfellows. But then in any case, what could be the premise of the Russian foreign policy activity now? Well, it's not formulated definitely with a certainty, but it does exist. And this is longing an attempt on the part of the Russian political elite to justify its international activity and domestic activity as well by addressing the concept of postmodernity, which means the following: everything is relative. There are no borders between the principles and norms. Everything is vague, everything is ambivalent, everything is ambiguous. No lines between peace and war, between legal and illegal, between sovereignty and interference. Everything is relative. So this is the best way to justify one's activity and one's foreign policy. And the result of this attempt to justify postmodernity is the demand for Russia to have the right to interpret, to give its own interpretation of the existing norms and standards. It has to resemble something to us. Carl Schmitt, probably. But in any case, this kind of ambivalence is supported not only in Russian political circles, but in the Western political circles as well. What is the agenda, the concrete specific goals of the Russian foreign policy? Of course, no doubt about that, abrogation of sanctions. This is the key task, and it's quite natural. Sanctions have started to bite. Not in a desperate, dramatic way, but still they are going to bite even in more desperately in the future. Hence, abrogation of sanctions. And more, Russia's return to the concept of great power. Because Russia cannot be great power being marginalized and being isolated. Russia could be great power only sitting at the table with other great actors. Not with Hungary, not with Poland, not with Baltic states, but first of all with the United States of America. America-centrism remains the core, the building principles of the Russian foreign policy and the guarantee that secures Russia's great power status, which is the basis, the spine of the Russian system. So America-centrism. The problem is how to return to bipolarity, having Trump in Washington. What to do with Trump? This is the major problem. What are other goals of the Russian foreign policy? What about NATO? I would say there are no kamikaze in the Kremlin. They are rather pragmatic people, at least tactically, and hardly Putin and his team are believing or dreaming about undermining Article 5, NATO Article 5. But they have still the toolkit at their possession to undermine the trust in NATO and demand Russia's veto for NATO actions in the East. This continues to be one of the goals of the Russian foreign policy. What about the instruments of the Russian foreign policy? Well, very briefly, because, there are too many articles, analysis that are dealing, with the ability of the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry and Russian diplomacy and Russian political elite to have resolve, to have possibility to undermine the Western actions. And among these tools and gimmicks, I would mention, first of all, the principle of unpredictability. This is one of the most efficient, most active instruments of Russian foreign policy. Among other, I would say cooptation, massaging of the Western elite, and hardly Russia's foreign policy. And the goal of personal integration into the West would have been successful without readiness on the part of the Western business, of the Western political leaders, of the Western punditry and political force to serve as clients for Russia, to serve as instruments, and to serve as the service class that helps Russia to export not only commodity, but corruption as well. Imitation also is one of the favorite tricks and gimmicks of the Russian political elite, and it helps a lot. Just one example of imitation, pivot to China. There is no pivot to China, and Russia understands that in the current situation with globalist ambition of China, of course it will be impossible to be equal with China in one bed. So that's why China and the whole rhetoric about pivot serves only as an instrument to get the Western attention. And Russia and the United States of America, very briefly, Putin-Trump bromance. There is no bromance. There is no relationship at all. There is paradox, frustrating for the Kremlin, frustrating really, shocking, paralyzed, and confounding for the Kremlin. Because on the one hand, what we have? On the one hand, we have definitely affinity of the Trumpian team and of the current White House, of course, should be welcomed in Russia, among the Russian political class, and it was applauded at the beginning, 1 month ago. The fact that Trump is definitely retrenching from Europe and definitely does not pay much attention to NATO agenda also is welcoming for Russia. And the fact that I'm mentioning now Tillerson's speech as the speech for the State Department early May, where Tillerson said that our foreign policy agenda for the United States of America will be pragmatism, not values, not democracy. Of course is appealing to Moscow. But this is one side of the story. There is another side of the story. And another side of the story is the following. America First. America First motto And already we understand what it does mean. America's first motto in Trump's, the word Trump's exercises means that America has any right to break any kind of rules which hardly could be welcomed in Moscow and in the Kremlin. Another thing, Trump's leadership, the way the former real estate mogul is trying to exercise foreign policy by cornering his opponents and rivals and partners into the corner and forcing them to make deals on his own terms, hardly is any recipe and platform for any kind of friendly relationship between him and Putin. And even more, the way Americans now and before, but now, to understand the bargain is totally different from Russian understanding of the bargain. In the Russian tradition, bargain means an exchange, just like Syria and Ukraine. Russia entered Syria trying to force the world to forget about Ukraine. And here's a kind of exchange idea. In America, it's rather compartmentalized. In America, still owe Russia, some kind of reciprocity for the Kremlin's support of the Iranian deal during Obama time. So there are so many things that make the whole relationship between Russia and Washington, especially in the current situation of dripping scandal, Russia scandal, in the situation when Russia became factor of the American infighting, and Russia became factor that could delegitimize Trump's presidency. This is the worst nightmare among the Russian political class, the nightmare of Putin. And I believe that Putin was candid and pretty sincere. One just yesterday in his interview to Figaro, he said that we never expected this to happen. We never had any plans to interfere this way into the American foreign policy. Of course not. Because any attempt on the part of Trump to normalize relations with the Kremlin would mean disaster for him and hardly will help the relationship. And any step in this direction will delegitimize Trump. So what to do? Now even the mainstream Russian experts are wrecking their brains, saying maybe we should just forget about America. Maybe we should just distance from America. Let's wait it over. But it could last, Russophobia for quite a while. Even after impeachment, if this is possible, of Trump, with Pence coming to the fore, any other president, it would be a headache for any president, any person in the White House to normalize relations with Russia. And having kicked over America's centrism, we do not have the real partner to deal with, to support, to secure our great power status. So this is America. Now time is running, and I'm approaching my final part of the comments. And Gudrun helped me with the rest. The Russian foreign policy, and we are dealing with Russian foreign policy, of course has still potential, even in the situation when domestic resources are dwindling, has potential to be effective in pursuing Moscow agenda. Why? Using the Western confusion, using the Western incoherence, so using the Western factors. But in any case, Russia, with its foreign policy that technologically, tactically could be successful, is meeting or is facing at least two conundrums. There are a lot more, but I will mention only two. The first conundrum is the following. This conundrum is related to foreign policy and is related to the great power status of Russia. Great power status in Russia is supported by majority of the population. Russians never lived in a normal country, never. They still are surviving within the great power paradigm. 75% of Russians do believe that Russia is a great country due to history, tradition, etc., etc. But if you ask them how they do understand what greatness is, 65% of Russians will tell you an unbelievable thing. Will tell you that great power means the power, the state, the civilization that allows people to live normally. And only 52% will say military might matters too. But if those people who support military might are asked, are you going to sacrifice for the sake of supporting aggressive behavior? Only 13% would say that they're ready to sacrifice. So you see, population is moving totally different understanding of great power status. And even Russian political elite that has been personally integrated into the West maybe would move in that direction, which undermines the previous traditional basis, platform of the Russian foreign policy and Russian system existence. And another conundrum, and I'm finishing here. I see your begging glance. The second conundrum is the following. I don't know what to do with it too. I'm racking my brains over it, and I don't know even how to explain it because I don't know what will be the result of this conundrum. The fact is that Russia is already in the election campaign. Elections next year, March 2018. And the Kremlin, Moscow, the political class need new legitimacy, new adrenaline, new idea how to consolidate the society and the nation, what it should be. War patriotism does not work. People are tired. People do not want it. People do not want any kind of confrontation. They want to live better. They want normal life. They want and need normalcy. But if besieged fortress is not working and should be dumped, dustbin, so what should be the idea? So a re-engagement with the West? But the Kremlin and Putin just understand it. They cannot do it just that. They need some kind of, backtracking from the West. They need the image of having victory. Is America, Germany, and France are ready, look at Macron and Merkel, are ready to give Russia the sense of victory in the confrontation with the West? Hardly. And if not confrontation, then so what? Opening. But Gorbachev ghost is haunting all people sitting and standing and lying in the Kremlin's corridors. Opening the windows and the doors to the West has the threat of unraveling again. So the political elite cannot afford it. So what? No idea of consolidating the nation. And being missionary nations, Russians cannot survive only being demoralized. So this is an open question. So the final sentence is the following. Yes, foreign policy is a potentially effective instrument. It still could work even with shrinking domestic resources. But the more effective foreign policy is, the more it helps the obsolete system to limp along. The system that is outdated. And the longer we prolong the period of waiting and stagnation, the higher the price will be of our transformation. Sorry to, I talk too much, I'm sorry. I love talking.
It was wonderful, thank you. We will continue the discussion, so. I am not at all concerned. I'm sure, in fact, Gudrun has plenty of questions for you that we will be able to elaborate on. And please, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much. Is this working? No?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. I really don't know where to begin, or whether I could actually contribute to something Lilia has comprehensively covered. Are you serious? I don't think it's working. Yes, I have this effect on technological things. As soon as I approach, they break down. It's one of my... I'm still going to move you a bit. Right. So I'll just lift a few points, and then I have a whole list of questions to delve deeper into. And relations between Russia and the West, it's sort of an eternal question, as old as the three constants in Russian history: who are we, what is to be done, and who is guilty. To my mind, we're living through a period, if we take a slightly longer time perspective, where colored by a choice between the basic, if I'm simplifying a bit, the two schools of Russian foreign policy and the great power status. One such school argues that Russia can only be great if it concentrates on its own economic developments, its infrastructure, its education, and we shouldn't have this buffer states or going on foreign adventures. That school is now very much behind. And the current school of thought says that Russia can only be great if it shows military might, if it is surrounded by weak states as a sort of a buffer zone to the heartland of Russia. And we can discuss this later. To your tools that you so comprehensively covered, I would also add history and the rewriting of history as a formidable tool in current Russian foreign policy. History is being rewritten to support the military might, the glory of Russia. And to me, the cleavage or the dividing line between Russia and the West, or so it seems to me, is growing regarding, on the one hand, values, and the other hand, interests. And what do I mean by that? Values, normally these days, when Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov talks about European values, he says the so-called European values. And when the Swedish Foreign Minister went to Moscow earlier in February, he specifically said this is good because certain states has now recognized that the so-called European values are no longer the primary interest, but it's the interest, the national interest of the state. So on to the questions for Lilia. To begin with, you touched on the issue of Russia, and the current regime is now trying to get a deal with the West somehow. I was wondering whether you could expand a bit on that. What would the deal look like? And how does this fit into the domestic view, or what they are saying domestically, namely that Russia is being surrounded by a hostile West just waiting to attack Russia? How much is rhetoric? How much is substance? Another question in line that follows from this, we sometimes get hear or people ask questions like, well, what Russia is doing is nothing strange, it's just responding to what the West has done. And the West has tried to undermine Russian stability using color revolutions and so on and so forth. So I was wondering whether you could talk a bit more on that view. We have, as you might have noticed, tried to avoid the thorny question of the future, but I would nevertheless tempt you to say something. Do you think that this is a temporary blip on Russia-Western relations, or do you think we're in for a longer period of adversarial relations? Right. One final point that I'd like you to respond to as well. We know from Russian history that whenever there's been an overstretch in the imperial ambitions and its great power projections, the reforms will come. You were hinting on this already, that they might have overstretched, that Russia has overstretched already. So I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on that point as well. Thank you.
Pretty formidable. And by the way, there are no answers at least to some of your questions, especially to the question to what extent Russia has overstretched itself. I do believe that we cannot in Russia succeed with partial reforms of Kudrin type that he suggests. Let's reform economy. Let's even proceed with radical economic modernization without changing the way Russia is ruled. It's impossible. But unfortunately, within the Russian political elite, there are no other groups that will deal with the idea of complex Russia's transformation. That will include updating the Russian constitution as well. Because Russia's Yeltsin's constitution, in fact, legitimizes the role of the Russian president, the Russian leader, who is standing above the fray and is not controlled by any branch of power. So far, within the Russian political elite, I don't see any group ready to start thinking about radical, not reform, transformation of the political basis. But at the same time, things are moving very fast. And there is understanding even within the Russian business community that is full of cowards, and within the Russian political class, that we need changes, and without changes, we cannot survive any longer. The problem is when the Russian political elite will be forced to think about transformation, and apparently such initiative never comes without some kind of social driver from outside. Secondly, whether the Russian relations with the West, based on assertiveness, is a blip, yes, or it has a longer perspective. I would say the Russian relations with the West, at least under the current political leadership, and we are thinking about possibility of the next 5, 7, maybe 10 years, will be based on the principle of duality. Just like it has been based during the whole period of Russia's and Soviet Union existence, cooperation and containment, that the Soviet and the Russian political elite has managed to do pretty successfully, switching on and off the degree of assertiveness. At the moment, the Kremlin is ready, wants and is longing to switch it on, to enter, I would say, the friendliness, the friendly mood period. Because in fact, Russia needs desperately not only to abrogate the sanctions, but to return to the West as the key supplier of technological, financial, and economic resource. So it will be switching on and off. And I would say that, at least in the nearest perspective, I would define the relationship as the attempt, I hope on mutual side, to manage mutual tension and distrust, to manage confrontational moods. But in the current new situation, when there is no more myth and dream, like it was in the 90s, and even 7 years ago, 5 years ago probably, about possibility of Russia being integrated as the country into the West. Partnership for modernization, we remember it all. So without any hope that Russia could be institutionally integrated into the West, there of course will be much more confrontational elements, and this formula will be difficult to manage. As for, you rightly mentioned the domineering in the Russian political narrative, domestic narrative, litany about Russia's being humiliated. But the problem is that, you know, as I mentioned, we have this kind of very strange, weird psychological conundrum. On the one hand, yes, we are humiliated by the West. But on the other hand, how could you pretend to be great power if you are constantly humiliated by Poles, Estonians, and Lithuanians? There is some kind of inconsistency. And then besides, if you pretend to be a great power, and this is the major thing of Russia's updated foreign policy, national security doctrine, there is the major thing line through the updated foreign policy doctrine that the West, as Sergei Lavrov has defined it, has outlived its historical time. The West is weak, and the time of the West is over. This is the line. So how to combine this litany about constantly being humiliated and being alternative to the West, and the country that is ready to fill the gap left by the West? There is some kind of inconsistency. And besides, how humiliated we are, if, by the way, we started to be humiliated 10 years after Americans started to withdraw from Europe. I mean the troops. When Obama started to retrench from Europe during Obama's period, it's not Trump, it's Obama started to retrench, okay? And when NATO stopped to expand in 2004, and still in 2006 and 5 and 6, Russia still was partner of the West. So apparently we forgot about being humiliated then and started to be humiliated now. So there is a kind of inconsistency that we Russians have to deal with. About the deals and bargains, well, this is the question that apparently I cannot answer. I can only elaborate. What is possible the trade and bargaining process on the part of the Kremlin? At the moment, quite clearly, we see Syria as a possibility to start bargaining. And by the way, President Putin, not only at his press conference, absolutely wonderful from the point of view psychology and body language with Macron, but in his interview to Figaro, President Putin was quite open about that. He said, in fact, I'm not quoting directly, but I'm just expressing his idea, the thought that he gave. We came with the olive branch. Don't blame us for America, so we are not guilty. And we are not guilty to that degree, definitely. And besides, in Syria, we are ready for a compromise. And before that, the 4 de-escalation zones that Russia suggested, okay, it was already outstretched hand. Just listen, we already can, discuss these zones and even further. And even he went even further, saying we are ready to listen to all ideas and thoughts in Figaro about the negotiation process. So he wanted to take the whole process from Astana again, together with France, Germany, and Americans. Let's do it together. So Syria is a place for bargaining. And my hunch, Assad is kind of trump card in the Russian pocket, but the value of this card is already shrinking. So Assad is part of the deliberation. But still, during the last week, Putin said, no bargaining on Ukraine. So Ukraine is a painful problem for Russia. And in Ukraine, at least Putin is not ready to backtrack. But other questions, Afghanistan, maybe Arctic, non-proliferation, there are several issues. And of course, this process that Moscow offers already for a long time to the West, anti-terrorist narrative, which Macron, by the way, is ready to support, which Trump, well, if he stays, is ready to support too. It's up to Chancellor Merkel to decide what Germany is ready to support. So at least there is kind of platform for dealing, for compromises, for trade-offs. The problem is that I'm looking at this from the domestic point of view. Well, these deals could normalize a relationship about some conflicts, but this normalization cannot help us domestically.
Right, thank you. I don't know, Martin, do you want me to continue asking? Or
Well, in fact...
Thank you for your questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Gudrun, for excellent reflections, and I'm sure we can come back to some. We can also take the opportunity to open up for the auditorium and some questions. I'm sure there are a lot of people who have thoughts. And I see already a few hands in the air, which is a very great pleasure. Okay, great. We have a triad of the Moscow ambassadors from Sweden.
Okay. In the meantime, when Lilia mentioned the partnership.
So Sven Hirdman. Yes. But
please,
okay.
A partnership for modernization. I couldn't help thinking about Lavrov's article last year on the historical roots of Russian foreign policy, and where he argued for the future, for a partnership of civilizations. So there you have something grand to reflect on. Sorry, yes.
Well, Lilia, based on your analysis of Russia's foreign policy, which I thought was very good, what is your assessment of the security situation in the Baltic Sea area, an area where Sweden happens to be located? And secondly, do you consider there is any threat of aggression against the Baltic countries? The two questions go together.
Ambassador Hirdman, thank you for your question, and I bet you'll answer your question much better than I will do. With my naive assessment of Russia-Baltic's relationship, I would say that I would refer to my previous comment. I don't believe that Russia, even with the developments in Kaliningrad region and possible Iskandar's access denial, etc., that has been pursued, by the way, in 2014, early 2015, before Syria gambit, I don't think that Moscow really is ready to threaten the Baltic states undermining Article 5 of the NATO treaty. But at the same time, it fits totally the current mood within the Russian foreign policy community and tradition to undermine the independence and the strength, and to constantly create possibility of blackmail and danger of breaking the window. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's not. Thus, I would say, I would call it a possibility of escalating and de-escalating, forcing the neighboring states by the danger of breaking the China and window to accept that or this line of the Russian foreign policy. So it will continue. This is how I see it. To what extent the new friendliness, if possible, in the relationship between the big elephants could influence this kind of blackmail, threat of breaking China policy towards the Baltic states, it's difficult for me to tell. Apparently, a lot depends, on the personal whims, psychology of the key architect of the foreign policy. And we have only one architect of foreign policy, who is not interested in all other issues. And to predict his behavior will be very difficult.
All right, Thomas and then Örjan.
I'm breaking ranks here. Thank you, Lilia, for a wonderful expose. You said that the mood of the confrontational mobilization, or the patriotic mobilization after Crimea, is vanishing. It has been exhausted, in a sense, with the great public, and of course the Kremlin is at a loss how to find an alternative mobilizing platform for the presidential election. My question is really, there is also a sign that the grip of the state television over Russian minds is also shrinking. It's an interesting expression I've seen lately, that the political agenda setting is migrating from Dmitry Kiselyov and the state television to YouTube, and they're quite different themes, are actually capturing the minds of the Russian public. Will this also have some relevance for finding openings in the foreign policy message, do you think?
Thomas, thank you for your comment, which is very relevant, and you're absolutely right. TV as the major source of propaganda and brainwashing is losing its impact, including not only impact on the younger generation. Younger generation does not watch TV in Russia. That's why younger generation is taken to the street with their own agenda, like they did, supporters of Navalny. But even traditional Russian electorate, the TV audience, also is unsatisfied with the previous, hammer-like kind of propaganda. To what extent this will change the foreign policy attitude? Despite of the propaganda, foreign policy moods even within Putin's electorate are being changed. People want normal life. So Kiselyov type of propaganda does not have impact. Even weekly programs against Ukraine, etc., with the same rhetoric, did not prevent the Russian respondents, more than 60%, would like to have friendly relations with Ukraine, and 68% of Russians would like to have Ukraine as a friendly, independent state. So we see already disconnect. But to what extent, it will allow the Russian audience to get a new vision of the world? Apparently, it will be a complicated process, because this vision has to be formulated by some sort, by some force, by some source, by pundits, etc., and they are not allowed on the state TV. The problem is, who is going to be the force that could formulate the vision, the foreign policy agenda, and appeal to the society, and what are the means of appealing if TV is out of reach? That's the major problem. But I agree with your comment, with your observation.
Okay, Örjan.
Am I heard? Yes, I think so. Well, I have one comment, or sort of a comment, and a question. The comment is following. One has a feeling that the foreign policy is now circling around an issue which you did not specifically mention, and that is the nuisance value of Russia. I'm thinking particularly of conflicts such as the North Korean one, where you see that Putin has criticized the American antics and the Trump policy and threats much more clearly than the Chinese have done. Of course, Russia has nothing like the leverage that the Chinese have, but they have come out much more clearly. Of course, that is just one of the issues. You have Iran, you have Syria, as you mentioned, you have Libya, which is, of course, also a matter where the Russians could play a role preventing any kind of solution, but could also be useful in reaching a solution. And then you have the cyber issue, which I think is quite interesting, because you can also claim that this also shows and sort of bolsters the feeling in Russia that we do play an enormous role, as the West is claiming that we influence elections all the time. So I think the nuisance value is quite an interesting aspect of Russian behavior. Now my question concerns Germany, because I mean the Merkel-Bierhalle speech was quite astounding, I thought, as she sort of distances not only Germany, but sort of takes the role to speak for Europe, distances Europe from the United States. And I think this is something which could be interesting, of course, in Moscow. And it would be interesting to hear your comments on the tenor of the Russian response to that speech.
Mm-hmm. Orion, thank you for your observation and for your comment. I fully agree. And I fully agree with your question about cyber and cybersecurity. That's an interesting element. You know, official Moscow is trying to negotiate with other actors possibility of some joint research or joint response to cyber threats, and is not insistent that Russia is able and capable to manage and manipulate elections in other countries, pointing the finger towards China. The Chinese could, but we can't. So apparently the Kremlin tries to some kind of silence, you know, and deactivate, if possible, any kind of, if there is, unregulated hackers activity on the Russian side. Regarding Germany, this is a fascinating topic, and I wonder, maybe Gudrun, you'll also join the discussion of Germany. For me, Germany has always been, for centuries, one of the key and much more important than America partner of Russia, not only through Ostpolitik, but for partnership through modernization and commercial links, and ability of Germans always to acquiesce the Russian tradition and the Russian interests and the Russian needs until apparently 2014, 2015, okay? Now Merkel, according to all information leaks, is the most, I would say, stubborn and the most, I would say, assertive partner in negotiations with the Kremlin. But again, I wonder how the Kremlin and the Russian foreign policy community will accept this new idea that was promoted by Merkel. We have to do our own fate and our own destiny. We cannot rely on other sources. That means we need to beef up our security and defense policy. We need to beef up our defense budgets. I wonder how the Kremlin will look at this opportunity. On the one hand, this opportunity means that Germany will be much more important, replacing the United States, at least during Trump, as a partner and opponent. And Russia and the Soviet Union have very good positive tradition of negotiating with Berlin. And Russian community will always remember Ostpolitik things and acquiescence mentality in German business and other social democratic political circles. So I would say that there will be cognitive dissonance within the Russian political elite. On the one hand, tradition says that with the exception of Merkel, we could always have good relationship, and 600 huge American companies still are in Russia, and they still need, good cooperation. But on the other hand, what to do with this Macron-Merkel bromance? Apparently they don't know, and nobody will answer what will happen. But apparently this is a new headache for the Kremlin. What do you think?
Right.
From the Swedish point of view.
Well, from my point of view, two things about the Merkel speech. It was held in Bavaria, the CSU tent, and it's a thorny issue. She needs to win them over on her side. in the upcoming elections. And the other reflection I have on that speech was it speaks volumes about the frustration of Angela Merkel after having met Trump several times and has never said anything, and she comes with this speech that, you know, it's absolutely clear we have to take care of ourselves because obviously the man in the White House is not to be trusted. So that's my take on it.
Thank you.
If I may ask a question, which is, of course, speculative. It relates to the first word in the title of the seminar, the future. As a seasoned politician by now, Putin has met Bill Clinton, then 2 terms with George W. Bush, then 2 terms Barack Obama, and now he's meeting a new political leader in the White House, Donald Trump. Do you think that even if Donald Trump would stay, it's a big if perhaps, according to some people, he would stay in power for 4 years, do you think that Putin will meet also a future US president? Meaning if he decides to run in 2018, and then according to the Russian constitution, he would be the president until 2024. What do you see this option? How likely is it, this scenario, that Putin will be a very long-term president of Russia?
You're asking me not only about political future, but about biological problem too. Well, so far, if we look at the scenario that Putin continues to stay, and he will outstay Merkel and definitely Trump, it looks like. You know, he's losing control over the domestic policy. And to what extent he could play the toy of foreign policy, losing control over the situation in the country, I wonder. But in any case, something interesting is happening with his mentality and with his behavior during 2016. He definitely doesn't want to play with several ideas that were cherished by the Russian political elite. The idea of the Russian world, the idea of Eurasia, even pivot to China in his exercise, how he was standing together with the Chinese leader. You could see the body language, and you could see that he definitely doesn't like being there. So apparently, firstly, he is looking for some much more accommodative approach to the West. And at the same time, he doesn't know how to combine this accommodative approach, because this is his platform now, how to combine this accommodative, his much more consensual approach with the West, with the necessity to keep Russia under tight thumb, and the only thumb could be the West is an enemy. It's a kind of, sitting on 2 chairs. It's kind of driving 2 horses in opposite direction. This game, to be and not to be, has been pretty successful until recently. But now the people are tied, the elite is tied, the resources are shrinking, and how much you have time to drive 2 horses in opposite direction. Well, definitely, the horses could tear you apart. And this is the major problem. This is the major conflict in his psychology, in his agenda, and in his policy. How to keep incompatible things, to cooperate, to use the West, to let the Russian elite to be integrated with the West, to let the representative of the Russian power structures and security forces, police, etc., finally travel to Turkey. They are not allowed anymore, okay? And at the same time, to keep Russia under control, preventing Gorbachev's window opening. He managed for such a long time, but you never say never.
All right, I see one hand, and that could be the final question from the auditorium before we summarize the discussion.
My name is Kjell Lundqvist from the Schiller Institute. It's strange. This should be about Russia-West relations, but it's mostly spoken about what's happening in Russia. Nothing about what's happening in the West. If you look, I must ask, the attitude from the West towards Russia is very, very different all over the West. It's not a common policy towards Russia, and it's even more complicated in the West than in Russia, that you rather good described the surface of, so to say. But I also think, what is China's role in this? How will they choose between the West or Russia as their big partner? Obviously, that must depend on the attitude from the West to China. And if the West do not join the Silk Road policy, the One Belt, One Road win-win offer by China, then for me, isn't it obvious that they will choose Russia instead from China? And that will change the whole world. Isn't that the case?
Last sentence, sorry, I misunderstood the last sentence.
If China's policy is rejected by West, which is very, especially from the EU. It has changed a little with Trump and China now. But before, Obama totally rejected the invitation from China to join the China project to industrialize the whole world. But Obama has, Trump has acted differently, but the West is not doing anything.
Shall, can I ask you to try to formulate the question?
Yeah. China's role and the West's attitude toward Russia and China, which is of course interconnected, in what way are they going? Especially when the West, you said the Russian economy is collapsing, but not the West economy. It's stagnation everywhere in the West.
Did you get the gist of it?
Comment.
It's more of a comment, but it's a reflection, and we can use these reflections perhaps for some final thoughts.
But I would agree with you that there is no collective Western strategy. The West is different. There is European policy, there is policy of the Russian Trojan horses in the West, there is US policy, yes. And the fact that there is no united, coherent policy towards Russia, even inside Brussels, by the way, expands the Kremlin's field for maneuver and expands Chinese field for maneuver and gives China more ambition to continue one way, one path road, including into Europe. Here I would agree with you.
Gudrun, do you have any final reflections on this topic or other topic?
On the eternal topic of Russian foreign policy, I could just recommend, I recently reread a book, and it's in English, if someone of you don't know Russian. It's written by Peter Truscott, came out in 1997. It's called Russia First. This is true. And there he concludes that any presidential candidate will need to put a Russia first strategy to win the next election, as Russia continues to evolve its Eurasian identity into the next millennium. So it's always refreshing to look back a bit.
Yes.
Thank you.
Lilia and Gudrun, it's been lovely listening to you, hearing your thoughts and discussions on this broad, beautiful topic. We thank you with a round of applause.
Thank you.